At some point in your growth journey, enjoyment changes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, and not in a way that clearly announces itself as a problem. You may still enjoy things. You still laugh at the right moments. You still recognize beauty, comfort, warmth. But something in experience no longer expands the way it used to. The pleasure arrives, registers, and then fades without leaving a strong trace behind. At first, this is barely noticeable. You assume the moment simply wasn't that good, or that you were distracted, or that repetition has dulled the edge of the experience. But as time passes, a pattern becomes harder to ignore. Things that once absorbed you now pass through more quickly. Enjoyment no longer lingers. Pleasure no longer organizes your day. This is not dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction carries restlessness. It pushes you to search for something better, something more stimulating, something that will finally satisfy. What you are experiencing does not push you anywhere. It simply does not hold you the way it once did. This distinction matters, because when enjoyment fades without restlessness, the psyche struggles to interpret it. You may begin to wonder whether something essential is going missing. You ask yourself quiet questions that feel slightly uncomfortable to admit. Why doesn't this feel as good as it used to? Why doesn't excitement last? Why do pleasant moments end so cleanly? There is often a brief search for explanation. You consider whether you are becoming emotionally dull, whether life has lost its color, whether you are growing indifferent without realizing it. But indifference has a particular texture. It involves withdrawal, a turning away, a lack of care. What you are experiencing is not a lack of care. You still care. You still show up. You still engage when something genuinely calls for it. What has changed is the intensity of the reward. Enjoyment no longer demands repetition. Previously, pleasure often came with subtle insistence. When something felt good, it asked to be extended, repeated, or intensified. There was a sense that the experience mattered because of how it felt, and that it should not end too soon. Now that insistence is gone. Moments feel complete while they are happening. When they end, they end. There is no urge to hold on to them, no disappointment that they are over, no craving for the next version of the same thing. This can feel disorienting, because for a long time, pleasure has not only been something you experienced, it has been something you used. Pleasure has been a signal. It has told you that life is working, that you are on the right track, that something is worth continuing. When pleasure becomes quieter, that signal weakens. And when signals weaken, the psyche grows uncertain. You may notice this uncertainty in how you anticipate things. Events you once looked forward to no longer generate much inner movement. You still attend. You still participate. But the anticipation itself feels muted, almost unnecessary. This is often where concern begins, because anticipation has been closely linked to aliveness. To anticipate something pleasurable has felt like proof that you are engaged with life. When anticipation fades, it can feel as though something vital is slipping away. But anticipation is not the same as presence. Anticipation is future-oriented. It relies on projection. It requires the mind to reach forward and imagine a reward. When that reward no longer feels necessary, anticipation naturally weakens. What remains is something simpler. You are there when you are there. You enjoy what is enjoyable. And when it ends, you move on. There is no commentary attached to this. No disappointment. No need to evaluate whether the moment was enough. This simplicity is unfamiliar, because pleasure has rarely been simple. For much of life, pleasure has been entangled with compensation. It has soothed discomfort, relieved pressure, distracted from tension, or temporarily resolved inner conflict. It has carried more weight than it appeared to. When those underlying tensions soften, pleasure no longer needs to perform those functions. As a result, it loses intensity, not because it is gone, but because it is no longer overloaded. At this stage, many people quietly begin to test themselves. They return to familiar pleasures to see if they still work. Music they once loved, activities that once absorbed them, experiences that once felt meaningful. When the reaction is calm rather than intense, concern grows. It can feel as though life is flattening. But flattening suggests reduction. What is happening here is redistribution. Pleasure is no longer concentrated into peaks. It spreads out. It becomes less dramatic, but also less fragile. This shift is easy to misinterpret because it lacks emotional punctuation. There is no clear signal that says, "This is fine." There is also no signal that says, "This is wrong." The absence of strong signals is itself the experience. And because the psyche has been trained to rely on strong signals, their absence creates uncertainty. You may notice yourself comparing present enjoyment to past enjoyment. You remember how intensely things once felt, how immersive certain moments were, how strongly pleasure once registered, and you may feel a faint sense of loss. Not because you are unhappy now, but because you remember being more moved. This comparison is natural, but it overlooks something important. Earlier pleasure often required intensity because it was compensating for something unresolved. It needed to break through inner resistance. It needed to overpower doubt, tension, or fragmentation. Now there is less resistance. There is less need to break through anything. So pleasure does not need to be loud. This does not feel like improvement. It feels like something being taken away. And that is why the stage is often misunderstood. The psyche has learned to equate intensity with depth. When intensity fades, depth is assumed to be fading as well. But depth does not depend on intensity. Depth depends on integration. An integrated psyche does not need to be flooded with sensation in order to feel real. It does not need to amplify experience to confirm its own existence. As a result, enjoyment becomes quieter. It no longer demands attention. It no longer insists on significance. It no longer needs to be stretched beyond its natural duration. This can feel anticlimactic because the world around you continues to promise more. More stimulation, more excitement, more feeling. When your internal response no longer matches those promises, it is easy to assume you are missing out. But missing out implies that something essential is absent. What is absent here is not pleasure. What is absent is the need for pleasure to carry psychological weight. That difference is subtle, but it changes everything. You may notice this most clearly in how quickly enjoyment resolves. A good conversation ends, and you feel complete. A pleasant activity finishes, and you do not wish it had lasted longer. A satisfying moment passes, and you are not preoccupied with recreating it. This clean ending can feel strange, because for much of life, endings were difficult. They came with longing, with disappointment, with a desire to rewind or repeat. When enjoyment ends cleanly, it removes the emotional aftertaste that once made pleasure feel important. And without that aftertaste, pleasure feels ordinary. Not bad, not disappointing, just ordinary. Ordinariness has been unfairly dismissed. It has been treated as a sign of stagnation, boredom, or decline. But ordinariness is often what remains when excess is removed. What you are encountering here is not the loss of enjoyment. It is the loss of excess enjoyment, the kind that overwhelms, distracts, or compensates. This realization does not immediately bring relief, because the psyche is still adjusting. It is still learning how to trust a quieter register of experience. It is still letting go of the belief that pleasure must be intense to be meaningful. At this point, there is often a lingering unease, not because anything is wrong, but because the familiar emotional markers are gone. You are no longer being pulled forward by pleasure. And without that pull, the psyche must confront a new way of relating to experience. This confrontation is not dramatic. It is understated. And because it is understated, it is easy to miss what is actually changing. Enjoyment is no longer organizing your inner life. It is participating in it. That difference marks the beginning of a very different relationship with pleasure, one that does not announce itself as improvement, but quietly alters how experience is held. What comes next is not the return of intensity, but a clearer understanding of why intensity was needed in the first place. Once the initial confusion around quieter enjoyment settles, the psyche begins to look for explanations. This search does not arise from curiosity. It arises from unease. Pleasure has long served as reassurance. When something felt good, it confirmed that life was moving in the right direction. It provided feedback. It validated effort. It compensated for uncertainty. When that feedback weakens, the psyche becomes suspicious. The first assumption is often emotional decline. The person wonders whether their emotional range has narrowed, whether they have become dull, muted, or less capable of feeling. This interpretation feels plausible because the change is measured in intensity. Pleasure no longer spikes. Excitement no longer builds. Enjoyment resolves too quickly. But emotional capacity does not disappear quietly. When emotional life collapses, it announces itself. There's constriction, withdrawal, heaviness. Experience becomes difficult to access. Feeling itself becomes effortful. What you are experiencing does not have that quality. Feeling still happens. Reaction still occurs when something genuinely touches you. What has changed is not access to emotion, but the degree to which emotion overwhelms the psyche. This distinction is often missed because intensity has been mistaken for depth. Another explanation that arises is overstimulation. The mind suggests that pleasure has dulled because too much has been consumed, that enjoyment has faded because novelty has worn thin. That repetition has blunted response. This explanation can feel convincing in a culture saturated with stimulation. But overstimulation produces a specific kind of dissatisfaction. It leads to craving for stronger input, for sharper contrast, for more extreme sensation. What you are experiencing does not move in that direction. You are not searching for stronger pleasure. You are not scanning for something that will finally break through. You are not restless. Instead, you are calm in a way that feels slightly unfamiliar. This calm is not sedation. It is containment. Containment is not the suppression of feeling. It is the psyche's ability to hold experience without being flooded by it. When containment increases, intensity naturally decreases. This is where misunderstanding often deepens. Because intensity has been culturally framed as the measure of aliveness. Passion, excitement, and emotional peaks have been celebrated as signs that something matters. Their absence is interpreted as decline. But psychologically, intensity often compensates for imbalance. When parts of the psyche are fragmented, pleasure surges act as temporary unifiers. They bring everything together for a moment. They create a sense of wholeness that does not yet exist structurally. As integration progresses, that compensatory function becomes unnecessary. The psyche no longer needs to be overwhelmed in order to feel cohesive. As a result, pleasure loses its excess. This does not mean pleasure is gone. It means pleasure no longer needs to perform psychological labor. Earlier, pleasure did more than feel good. It stabilized identity. It soothed anxiety. It confirmed worth. It distracted from inner conflict. Now, those functions are no longer required, and without them, pleasure becomes simpler, shorter, quieter, less consuming. This shift often creates confusion because the psyche has not learned how to interpret simple enjoyment. It expects pleasure to justify itself, to leave an impression, to mean something beyond the moment. When pleasure no longer does that, it can feel empty by comparison. But emptiness is not the correct word. The experience is closer to sufficiency. Enough happens. Enough is felt. Nothing needs to be added. This is difficult to accept because it removes a familiar reward structure. Previously, pleasure motivated repetition. It encouraged pursuit. It created anticipation. These cycles organized behavior and gave life a rhythm. When pleasure stops driving repetition, those cycles dissolve. The psyche is left without a familiar incentive. This is where anxiety sometimes enters. Not because pleasure is gone, but because the old reason for doing things has vanished. You may notice this in small decisions. You do not feel particularly drawn toward activities you once enjoyed, but you also do not feel opposed to them. You may still participate, but without the inner surge that once preceded the action. This can feel confusing, because the absence of anticipation has been equated with lack of engagement. But anticipation is not engagement. Anticipation is projection. It pulls experience into the future and loads it with expectation. When expectation dissolves, experience returns to the present, and the present is often quieter than imagined futures. This quietness is often misread as boredom, but boredom contains irritation. It involves resistance to the present moment. It seeks escape. What you are experiencing lacks that resistance. You are not trying to escape the moment. You are simply not amplifying it. This distinction becomes clearer over time. You may notice that when something genuinely pleasant happens, you register fully. There's appreciation. There is warmth. But there is no urgency to extend it or intensify it. When it ends, it ends. This clean ending can feel unsettling because pleasure has often been associated with attachment. Enjoyment has historically created desire for more. When enjoyment no longer creates attachment, it feels incomplete according to old standards. But those standards were never neutral. They were shaped by a psyche that needed pleasure to regulate itself. Now that regulation is more stable, pleasure can relax. This relaxation does not feel like gain. It feels like subtraction. And subtraction is often interpreted as loss. Another misunderstanding arises around meaning. Pleasure has often been intertwined with meaning. Enjoyable experiences felt meaningful because they felt good. When pleasure quiets, meaning seems to quiet as well. This leads to the fear that life is becoming flat. But meaning that depends on pleasure is fragile. It rises and falls with stimulation. It requires constant reinforcement. It collapses when intensity fades. When pleasure stops carrying meaning, meaning does not disappear. It detaches. This detachment can feel like emptiness because the psyche is accustomed to locating meaning in emotional peaks. Without those peaks, meaning no longer announces itself. It exists more quietly, and quiet meaning is easy to miss. At this stage, many people try to reintroduce intensity deliberately. They seek stronger experiences. They increase stimulation. They attempt to provoke feeling. These efforts rarely produce lasting satisfaction. The psyche resists being overwhelmed again, not out of moral restraint, not out of discipline, but out of balance. The system has reorganized itself in a way that no longer requires excess. This resistance can be misinterpreted as emotional shutdown, but shutdown involves avoidance. What is happening here involves discernment. The psyche no longer accepts stimulation indiscriminately. It no longer floods itself in response to every opportunity for pleasure. This discernment is not conscious. It is structural. The nervous system has learned that it does not need intensity to maintain coherence. This learning process is subtle. It does not come with insight or clarity. It comes with changed thresholds. What once felt exciting now feels neutral. What once felt overwhelming now feels ordinary. What once demanded repetition now resolves cleanly. These changes can be disorienting because they alter how life feels without altering how life functions. You still move through the world. You still participate. You still respond. But the emotional volume is lower, and lower volume is often mistaken for disengagement. This is where comparison becomes problematic. Comparing current enjoyment to past enjoyment assumes the psyche is the same. It is not. Earlier pleasure was filtered through unresolved tension. Current pleasure is filtered through integration. These are not equivalent states. One requires intensity to be felt. The other does not. As this becomes clearer, the anxiety around fading pleasure begins to shift, not disappear, but reorient. The question, why doesn't this feel as good as it used to, slowly loses its urgency. It is replaced by a quieter observation. This feels different. Different, not worse, but different enough to challenge old assumptions about what enjoyment is supposed to feel like. This challenge does not require resolution. It requires recognition. Recognition that pleasure has changed not because something is missing, but because something is no longer necessary. The psyche is no longer compensating. And compensation, when removed, always looks like loss before it looks like stability. This understanding does not immediately bring comfort, but it introduces accuracy, and accuracy reduces confusion. Pleasure has not faded because you are losing your capacity to feel. It has faded because it no longer needs to shout. What remains is a quieter form of enjoyment that does not announce itself, does not linger, and does not demand continuation. This form of enjoyment is easy to overlook, but it is not empty. It is simply no longer carrying more than it should. The next movement will not attempt to restore intensity or explain how to enjoy more. Instead, it will look at how the psyche stabilizes when enjoyment no longer needs to prove anything, and how the stabilization subtly reshapes daily life without drawing attention to itself. Over time, the quieter nature of enjoyment begins to feel less strange, not because intensity returns, and not because pleasure becomes more vivid again, but because the psyche stops expecting enjoyment to perform a function it no longer has. The absence of strong emotional payoff gradually loses its threat. What once felt like a warning signal begins to register as a neutral condition. This shift does not announce itself. There is no moment when you realize that pleasure has stabilized. Instead, you notice its effects indirectly in how little attention you now give to enjoyment itself. You stop monitoring whether things feel good enough. You stop comparing current moments to past ones. You stop checking whether pleasure is still working. Enjoyment simply happens when it happens. And when it does, it no longer asks for justification. This is often when people begin to realize that pleasure has moved from the center of experience to its periphery, not because it has become unimportant, but because it no longer needs to be central in order to be felt. Earlier in life, pleasure often carried excess responsibility. It had to reassure you that life was meaningful. It had to offset inner tension. It had to confirm that effort was worthwhile. Now, pleasure has been relieved of those tasks. It can exist without pressure. This changes how it is experienced. Enjoyment no longer builds toward a peak. It does not demand continuation. It does not leave a residue of longing when it ends. It arrives, completes itself, and dissolves without complication. This can feel understated, but understatement is not absence. What has disappeared is not pleasure itself, but the psychological inflation that once surrounded it. Inflation made pleasure feel larger than life. It exaggerated its importance. It turned moments of enjoyment into evidence of progress, success, or fulfillment. Without inflation, pleasure returns to its natural scale. It becomes proportionate. This proportionality is often mistaken for loss because it removes drama. But drama was never a reliable indicator of depth. It was an indicator of imbalance. As proportional enjoyment becomes familiar, another change begins to register. Life feels less interrupted. Previously, pleasure functioned as a break in experience, a high point that separated itself from ordinary time. When it ended, there was often a sense of falling back into something less desirable. Now there is less contrast. Moments of enjoyment blend more easily into the rest of life. There is less of a divide between good moments and everything else. This blending can feel flat at first, but flatness implies uniformity. What is happening here is continuity. Experience no longer needs to be punctuated by peaks in order to feel tolerable. The psyche no longer relies on emotional spikes to regulate itself. This continuity creates a different relationship with time. Moments pass without needing to be marked as special. Activities end without needing to be evaluated. Pleasure does not linger, but neither does disappointment. There's a quiet sense of adequacy. Enough has happened. Enough has been felt. Nothing more is required. This sense of adequacy is often overlooked because it does not demand attention. It does not feel like achievement. It does not feel like fulfillment. It does not feel like arrival. It feels ordinary. And ordinariness has long been misinterpreted as a problem. But ordinariness is often what remains when psychological excess has been resolved. This is where enjoyment quietly changes its role. Instead of being something you seek, it becomes something you notice. Instead of motivating action, it accompanies action. Instead of defining moments, it fills them. This does not make enjoyment less real. It makes it less strategic. You are no longer using pleasure to manage inner life. You are no longer relying on it to compensate for uncertainty, fragmentation, or pressure. As a result, enjoyment no longer carries psychological urgency. It does not need to last. It does not need to intensify. It does not need to justify itself. This can feel unfamiliar because the psyche has been trained to value experiences based on how strongly they register. When that register quiets, value appears to decrease. But value has not decreased. Measurement has changed. Earlier, value was measured by intensity. Now it is measured by fit. What fits the moment is sufficient. What fits your capacity is enough. What fits reality does not need embellishment. This change often becomes visible in how easily you let things go. A pleasant experience ends, and there is no impulse to replay it. A good moment passes, and there is no urge to preserve it. Memory does not cling, because nothing feels unresolved. This lack of clinging is not indifference. Indifference involves disconnection. What you are experiencing involves completion. Experiences feel complete as they are. They do not ask for continuation because they do not leave a sense of lack behind. This is one of the quieter markers of psychological integration. When experiences no longer need to be held on to in order to feel real, the psyche is no longer fragmented around them. Enjoyment becomes part of life, not an escape from it. This shift also alters how disappointment is experienced. When pleasure was intense, its absence felt dramatic. Disappointment carried weight because it represented a failure of expectation. Now, expectation itself is softened. When something does not deliver enjoyment, it registers briefly and then dissolves. There is no narrative built around it, no conclusion drawn about life as a whole. This does not make life more exciting. It makes it more stable. And stability has rarely been celebrated, but stability allows something subtle to emerge. A form of engagement that does not depend on emotional payoff. You participate because participation fits. You enjoy when enjoyment appears. You move on when it ends. There is no internal commentary asking whether the experience was enough. It was what it was. This simplicity does not feel like loss once it is recognized. It feels like relief. Not relief from pain, but relief from excess. Excess feeling. Excess expectation. Excess pressure placed on moments to deliver more than they naturally can. Pleasure has not diminished. It has been relieved of burden. And in that relief, it becomes quieter, cleaner, and less demanding. When enjoyment changes, it is easy to assume something is missing. But what often disappears is not pleasure itself, but the role it once played in holding the psyche together. When that role is no longer necessary, enjoyment returns to its proper size. It no longer needs to convince you of anything. If this describes a shift you've been noticing, you're welcome to subscribe to the channel for future reflections on life after inner growth stops being the answer. We continue this exploration through the lens of Carl Jung. You can also share this video with someone who feels unsettled by how pleasure has changed for them. And if you want to continue the conversation, feel free to leave your thoughts or experience in the comments. Hearing how this shows up in different lives often deepens the understanding for everyone.